Today I'm going to be talking about all the books I read in the month of February. I pulled out my chair. I want to get cozy today because I read a lot in February. We're going to be here a while. I wanted to be comfortable. I hope you're comfortable. Grab a drink, grab a blanket, settle in. We have a lot to discuss. As always, I go in order from my least favorites to my most favorites of the month, starting with the books I DNF'd, which are the books that I did not finish. And this month there was only one. That was The Antique Hunter's Guide to Murder by C.L. Miller. This is a murder mystery that is about this antique hunter who was murdered, and one of the people that they mentored is trying to solve the case. There is a historical artifact, antique situation that they're trying to hunt down. I ended up DNFing this 20% in. I just did not find it that interesting. I was listening to it on an audiobook and I just could not get pulled into the mystery of this one. And I have not been hearing good reviews of it otherwise, so I didn't feel overly invested. I decided to sit it down at the 20% mark and did not finish it. The only book that I gave a 1 star to this month was This Wretched Valley by Jenny Kiefer, which is unfortunate because this was a book that I was reading for a book club discussion this month. I was reading this for Sav's book club, which is the Lights Out book club. Her channel is Riveting Reads, and Mel also was joining for the discussion. I love a good book club. You know, I love to be a part of a book club. I'm so thankful when my friends ask me to join their book clubs and join in on a book club discussion. It's just what I'm here for. The community reading, that's what it's all about. So I'm not even mad that I ended up reading this whole book and gave it a 1 star. That's okay. That happens sometimes, and we actually all, I think by the end, gave it a 1 star rating as well. None of us enjoyed this book, so the live show was kind of fun to just go through and remember what we could of this book, talk about what we felt like we could of this book, but ultimately get a little bit of validation and catharsis for our own experiences with not enjoying it and feel like we had that community with one another. This is a story about these 4 people who go rock climbing in Kentucky. The book begins with you finding out that they have all died except for one of them has gone missing, and then you go back in time and you relive this experience with them and see what happened to them. The synopsis kind of poses this as it could have been anything. Were the climbers murdered? Did they succumb to cannibalism? Or are their impossible bodies the work of an even more sinister force? If you want to hear all of our thoughts about this, we talked pretty at length, non-spoilery, because honestly there's not a ton to spoil in this book, so you can go check out that live show if you want. I will have that link down below. But my ultimate issues with it were I did not feel connected to these characters at all. They didn't feel like real people to me, so I couldn't care about them, and so I was extremely bored the entire time. But there are some people who've really enjoyed this, so if wilderness horror is specifically something you enjoy, maybe check out some other reviews and see if you want to give it a shot. The only other book that I read this month that received less than a 3-star rating from me is a surprising one, because I have seen this getting rave reviews from a lot of people, but I did not enjoy it as much. I gave it a 2.5 star, and that is First Lie Wins by Ashley Elston. This book sounded really interesting and it sounded like a thriller that would be right up my alley, but it just was not that entertaining to me. The premise of this one is you're following this woman named Evie Porter, and Evie Porter has this beautiful, perfect life, living with her boyfriend Ryan. Everything's good and fine and dandy, but Evie Porter doesn't really exist. This is a woman living under a false identity, and she ends up being confronted by another person who is assuming her real identity. So the book follows Evie as she's trying to understand what's going on with this person, assuming her identity, and there is a pretty big thing that happens pretty early on in the story that is not revealed in the synopsis that really kicks off the events. I found this book to be really boring and slow-paced for me. There are a lot of flashbacks to when Evie would assume different identities, and you're seeing her as many different people throughout the years going through different things, and those chapters pulled me out of the story. They felt very repetitive to me, and I don't feel like they added a lot for me. I found the story to be really slow-paced. It just did not feel like much was happening. The only thing that bumped it up from a 2 to a 2.5 was I did like the ending. I thought it was impressive how the ending ties everything together, and that was satisfying. But otherwise, one of the big twists in the story I thought was pretty predictable, so I was just waiting for it to happen the whole time. The flashbacks pulled me out of the story too much, and it just felt really slow-paced for a thriller. I do think I'm an anomaly here. I don't really think I've seen anyone else else not enjoy this book. For the people I follow, it seems like most of them are really enjoying this thriller. So if it's something you had your eye on, still pick it up. I wanted to pick it up because I was pretty sure this is going to be one of the big thrillers of the year. Since it's a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, I could see this being in the Goodreads Choice Awards at the end of the year. So I didn't want to miss the initial wave of it. And that alone is enough for me. I'm glad I read it, so I know what everyone's talking about. But this one just wasn't really up my alley. One of my 3-star reads for the month was Severance by Ling Ma. This is a post-apocalyptic type of story, but I've heard it's more of a quiet, literary, slow burn kind of post-apocalyptic story. So I wasn't expecting, you know, like zombies or anything in this, but it still ended up being different from my expectations. I did enjoy this one, but it just wasn't the story that I thought I was going to be getting. The synopsis for this book talks about Candace Chen, a millennial drone self-sequestered in a Manhattan office tower who is devoted to routine. So she barely notices when a plague of biblical proportions sweeps New York. The Shen fever spreads, families flee, companies halt operations, the subway squeak to a halt. Soon entirely alone, still unfevered, she photographs the eerie abandoned city as the anonymous blogger NY Ghost. Then the synopsis talks about how she joins a group of survivors led by this guy named Bob, and how they're traveling to a place called the Facility, where Bob promises that they will have everything they need to start society anew. So based on that synopsis, I thought this book was going to be very much following the aftermath of this apocalypse situation. You were going to be following her alone in New York for a while after the devastation happens, and then joining a group of survivors, and that the story would go from there. But actually, a lot of this book takes place in different points of time. You follow Candace growing up throughout her childhood. You see the immediate after effects of the plague or virus, whatever it is, sweeping New York, and how she ends up staying in her office and going to work every day. And then the present day is her with a group of survivors, but that doesn't feel like it takes up as much of the book as the past flashbacks do. I thought the writing of this was really good. It has a really solid tone and authorial voice. I was very immersed in the story, and I did do the audiobook of this one, and I really enjoyed the narrator. So I do think if you are picking this up, I would recommend checking out the audiobook of it. It is a little bit plotless, so if you don't like books that are character driven, if you want a lot of plot, this one's probably not going to be for you, but I did enjoy it. It was just sort of meandering and reflective and talking about the challenges that Candace was personally facing and also the challenges that the world was facing. And the part that I found the most interesting was the experience that she has with the group of survivors. So I do wish that would have been more of what the book was, but that's just not what it intended to be, so that's more of a me problem, not really a book problem. It also kind of reminded me of Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, so if you enjoyed that, you might want to pick this one up as well. The other 3-star read I had this month is Only If You're Lucky by Stacey Willingham. This is now the 3rd book I have read from Stacey Willingham. I gave A Flicker in the Dark 4 stars, I gave her second book 2 stars, and this one I gave 3 stars. So I've been sort of all over the board with her stories. This is one that, to be honest, I was not super interested in, and it didn't sound like something I would particularly enjoy, but it's Stacey Willingham, and I figure this is probably going to be in the Goodreads Choice Awards, and so similar to First Lie Wins, I wanted to hop on it while it was hot. I wanted to read it when it first came out, and I had some Book of the Month credits to use, so why not? This is a story about some college women, so you're following your main character, Margot, and she goes off to college and meets this woman, Lucy, who is just like this popular it girl. She's just enamored by Lucy, and so Margot ends up joining this friend group that involves Lucy, Nicole, and Sloane. That is their friend group, and they spend the year together, but by the end of the year, a fraternity brother is found murdered and Lucy is missing. So the story jumps back and forth in time at different points as you're following Margot's story before she ever interacted with these people, right when she was getting to know them, and then the present day of what's going on now that Lucy is missing and a fraternity brother is dead. I kind of sensed where that story would go based on the synopsis. It just didn't sound like something that I would particularly enjoy, but I didn't have a bad time with this one. I think Stacey Willingham does do a good job building characters and building like a town atmosphere and getting you immersed in her stories. So I thought it was fine. I gave it a 3-star. If it does sound particularly interesting to you, it's probably worth picking up. I did like what the story did a little bit. There was like a little surprise early on that made me intrigued in the story, and I think that is what hooked me into it more than it would have if it was just the basic synopsis. I won't reveal what that is because it's a little bit of a spoiler, but it did get me more intrigued in what was actually going on here in this situation, and all in all, I didn't have a bad time. One of my 3.5-star reads of the month is Interesting Facts About Space Space by Emily Austen. This was my first book from Emily Austen, and I just thought it sounded interesting, for lack of a better word. I don't really read a lot of sad girl books, and I would probably categorize this as a sad girl book, or catastrophe female is a word I see thrown around too. This is about this woman named Enid, who I think is in her 20s, maybe 30s, and there's not a lot of plot here. It's a very character-driven story. She is obsessed with space, and so she likes to tell interesting facts about space to her mother, hence the title here. And she's just going through life experiencing dating woes. She is terrified of bald men, and she thinks a bald man is following her around and breaking into her apartment, and that's a big part of the story. And she has some half-sisters who she's kind of trying to form a relationship with. So you're just kind of watching her stumble through life, facing the challenges that she is. I can't really explain why I liked it, I guess. It just had a sort of can't look away quality to it, where you're watching this extremely relatable human experience and you're just spending some time with Enid and her story and this little slice of life that she has, and she's coming to learn some things about herself and she's coming to grow in some ways. The ending gets a little bit weird because there's almost like a twist, but then it's like not a twist sort of situation, so that was a little bit strange. But all in all, I enjoyed the book. I enjoyed spending time with Enid, and I gave it a 3.5 star. Another 3.5 star I had is The Haar by David Sodergren. This was my buddy read for the 24-hour horror-a-thon that we did in February, and Lexi from Books with Lexi was my co-host. We did a live reading sprint session where we were reading this book, so I'll have that link down below if you want to check that out and hear some of our updates of how we were feeling as we were reading the book. This is a story about a woman named Muriel who lives in this Scottish fishing village in this small little area. She's been there forever. Her husband has died, and so she is grieving him a lot throughout the story, and there are these new developers trying to come in and buy up her house and all of the neighbors' houses, and they're trying to fight back against it. She doesn't want to give up her house, especially not the house that she lived in with her husband. And then one day there is this strange fog that comes off of the ocean that Muriel ends up in, and she ends up encountering this interesting creature that becomes a significant part of her story. This book is described as romantic and deranged, which is an interesting way to describe it, but it's not too far off. There were a lot of things that I really liked about this story and the writing and the general weirdness of it all, but the main reason why it was a 3.5 and not higher is because it did feel a little disjointed at times. The tone switches from being very melancholy and full of grief and serious and reflective to being a little campy and gory and silly and just a different energy that kind of shifts back and forth a little bit and wasn't exactly what I was expecting. I still enjoyed the story. This was my first read from David Sodergren. I'll definitely be reading more from him in the future. Just be prepared that there's a lot of gore in this, so if gore is not something you want, probably don't pick it up. Another 3.5 read I had this month was Thirst, and this also was a 3.5 because it did also feel a little bit disjointed. That's kind of the nature of the setup of this story. It's written in two parts. It splits at the 50%. In one part, you're following one woman in the past, and in the other part, you're following a woman more in the present timeline. The woman you're following in the past is a vampire. And then in part two, you're following a human who is connected to her in some way, but to tell you that would be a spoiler. But their paths do end up intersecting. And this is a story that is also a little bit plotless. There's some plot to it, but it's a really slow burn. It's a gothic story. It has sapphic elements to it. There's a lot of loneliness, and again, kind of like a melancholy feeling to the story. I don't think you can really tell from the synopsis the way the story is going to be structured. I think the synopsis leads you to believe you're going to be spending a lot of time with this vampire and this human woman meeting and seeing what happens when their lives collide, but really you spend a lot of time with each of them individually. And so I think my expectations were maybe just a little bit off for it, but I did enjoy it. I thought the writing was really great, especially because this is a translated work, and so I think it's always just impressive when the tone and intention can be preserved even going through a language translation. I did read this in a reading vlog where I was reading a couple new thriller and horror arcs, so I'll have that link down below if you want to check that out and see my full thoughts and experience with Thirst. Another book I vlogged this month, but in a different vlog, is Everyone on This Train is a Suspect by Benjamin Stevenson. I always want to say this is by Ernest Cunningham because this is a story about an author, Ernest Cunningham, who is talking to you, the reader in the book, so it's a little bit meta and confusing at times to distinguish the names of the authors in my head. But this is a sequel. The first book in this series was called Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone, and you don't necessarily have to read the first book to be able to read this book. This book does follow the events of the first book, but it doesn't spoil the first book, and there's nothing critical that you need to know from the first book to go into this book. But I would recommend reading both, especially because I did enjoy the first book more. The first book I gave a 4-star. This book I gave a 3.5 star. In this story, you're following a bunch of people who are on this train, and they're on this train for this convention where it's a bunch of murder mystery writers and psychological thriller writers coming together to talk about their books and whatnot. And then a murder occurs, and so Ernest has a lot of people on the train who are experts in the field, sort of, because they write about murder and crime, but also because they're experts, that makes them the perfect suspects. Hence, everyone on this train is a suspect. So Ern is trying to solve the murder mystery of why the murder happened on the train. Like I said, I did vlog my experience with this, so you can go check that out if you want to see full thoughts, full experience, but it was just not living up to my hopes and dreams. It felt slower paced than I thought it would. I kind of accidentally got to the 70% mark and didn't realize I was 70% into the story because it didn't feel like a lot had happened. So I was just feeling a little underwhelmed by it. I do still like what this book does and how the narrator plays little games with the reader. In this story, initially the narrator tells you that the killer's name will be mentioned 106 times throughout the story, and then frequently the narrator will check in with you and give you a list of all the characters and the number of times they've been mentioned, and also says like people could be assuming multiple identities. So it's just like a fun little game. It breaks the fourth wall, it has a little gimmick to it. The narrator's really witty and it plays like on mystery tropes, but it's a fair play mystery and it's just a lot of fun. But the mystery in this one I just didn't think was as compelling as it could have been. I will still keep reading in this series if this author does more in this series, or if they just write something else, I'll read that too because I do really like the writing style. Next is a weird one for me. My reading's been a little bit weird this year so far, but I'm just branching out a little bit and just reading what feels interesting to me at the moment. And so one of my 4-star reads this month was The Assassin's Blade by Sarah J. Maas. I have read from Sarah J. Maas before. I have read the ACOTAR series all the way up to the last book, or the most recent book at this point, A Court of Silver Flames, which I actually DNF'd about 200 pages in, but I do plan to go back and finish that book eventually. But something was just calling me this year to read Throne of Glass. I have always had this series on my radar since I read the ACOTAR series years ago, and I think I was mentioning this around like November, December time, but I've just been getting really into the concept of series again. I have not been a series girl for a long time, especially when it comes to books. I just want one and done. I don't want to read 7, 8, 9 books in a series, but something around the end of the year, I was just really getting back into like movie series. I was rewatching The Hunger Games. I was rewatching all kinds of stuff. 50 Shades of Grey was one of those things. I was watching any kind of series, and I was just kind of itching to get into some more book series, and this was one that's been on my radar for a long time because I did enjoy the ACOTAR series. I really don't read much fantasy at all, but there's something about this writing that's just really accessible and hooks you and gets you interested in the story. So I did try The Assassin's Blade on, technically now it's called the Everand app, it used to be known as Scribd, but I was reading an ebook there and I decided to read the first novella because this is a collection of I think 5 novellas, and I decided that if I liked the first novella, that was a really easy entry point to see if this was going to be a series that would be up my alley, and I did like it. So I kept reading and I did end up purchasing the physical copy and reading the full book. Sorry if the angle changed. Camera battery just died. We swapped it out. But anyway, I read the full thing. I was a little bit nervous going into this series because I have heard ACOTAR is more of a romance, Throne of Glass is more of a fantasy series, and I really liked the romance parts of ACOTAR, as I feel like many people do. That's what gets me kind of pulled into something that is a little bit out of my comfort zone. I don't read a lot of fantasy, I read a little bit of romance, but like everyone can kind of relate to a romance. So anyways, didn't know how I'd feel about it, but I like it, and I did decide to start with The Assassin's Blade, which I know is, you know, a whole thing. Some people think you should read this first, some people think you should read it in publication order, but I consulted the expert that I trust, which is my friend Hannah from Hannah's Recent Reads, and Hannah has read these books more than probably anyone else in the world. So if I'm gonna trust anyone, I'm gonna trust Hannah, and Hannah said to read this first. So if you've got a problem with that, take it up with her. I'm just kidding. Don't go yell at her. You can take it up with me. I feel good about this. I'm glad I started here. I feel like it'd be really difficult for me personally to want to go back and read a prequel novella collection once I'm already immersed in a series, especially if you know things that are going to happen. I think this had a nice emotional impact, not really knowing anything. I'm just going in, getting to know these characters for the first time. And oh my God, yeah, the ending's devastating, which I did see in reviews, and ow, yeah, it hurt my heart. So anyways, I've had this sort of idea when I was thinking at the end of last year that I wanted to pick up a series. I was thinking it might be fun to have a longer series to read throughout the year and to aim to read one book per month. So that's what I'm going to try to do with the Throne of Glass series. I'm going to try to do one book per month throughout the year. If I get really pulled into it, maybe I'll read them faster. I don't know, but that's kind of the goal. So you'll see these interspersed throughout my wrap-ups. It's a little bit weird for me, but this is one of the most popular series out there, so it's probably not that weird. Another 4-star I had is The Wishing Pool and Other Stories by Tananarive Due. This is now the second full published thing that I've read from Tananarive Due. I've read a novel from her in the past. I read The Between and I really enjoyed that and also gave it a 4-star. And I have read some short stories from Tananarive Due that have just been in other collections I've picked up over the years. So this is the second time I'm reading like a full thing published by her, and this is a collection of short stories that she's had published in other places. I think some of these are probably new to the collection, but based on the end little pages, it sounded like these have been published in other places before, and now they were putting this collection together. I really think Tananarive Due is one of the best horror writers out there right now, and if you're not reading her, are you even reading horror? She just has such a talent for creating characters who feel so real, so quickly. Sometimes in like 3 paragraphs, you're like, wow, I know this person. Like, I'm in this story. What's happening? I'm with you. Let's go. It is unbelievable. I just truly feel like her character work is so excellent, and she has such good range. There's such a range of stories in this collection. There are typical like haunting kind of places, or like a haunted bookstore kind of story in here, road trip moments. There's more like dystopian stories in here. It really branches a lot of different things, and I feel like she's so talented at doing so many different things that even if a story is focusing on a trope that is something I don't typically gravitate towards, I still enjoy reading it from Tananarive Due. So I'm really glad that I read this. I took notes of my ratings for each story in this collection, so I'll put that all in a graphic and put it up here so you can see what all my ratings were. My favorite stories in here were Haint in the Window and One Day Only, but there were so many 4-stars I had in here as well. There was just so much I really enjoyed, and I only had one story that was a 2-star. I also wanted to try to read The Reformatory by Tananarive Due this month, but I just didn't get around to having time to fit that in, but I'm hearing such good reviews for it, so I am hoping to read that one soon as well, even though it's very long. That one's a long one, but I think it's gonna be worth it because she's truly just such a great writer. My last 4-star of the month was Kill for Me, Kill for You, which I just saw today is actually a book of the month pick for the month of March. So if you have book of the month and you're looking to pick something, I would recommend picking this. I think this is really widely recommendable, very easy to recommend to many people. I think this is something that will be widely enjoyed. It is a thriller that is a strangers on a train retelling, so that just means a story about 2 people who meet and they both want people murdered, so they decide to commit the murders for each other so that the murders can't be traced back to them. This story throws in an interesting element as well, where there is a third character you're following in the story and you're trying to piece together how her story connects to the other women's stories. And I just think this was really well done. It was fast-paced, it was intriguing, it had nice short chapters, it had interesting, unique elements to add to this trope. It wasn't overly predictable. There's kind of a twist/reveal in the end that I feel like people might not love as much, but I thought it was kind of fun because it surprised me. And overall, I just think it was a good time. I did also read this in that reading vlog where I was reading new thriller and horror arcs, so you can check that out if you want to see my full thoughts and experience with this one. But overall, I had a really good time with it. It is so far, I think, the only thriller I've really enjoyed this year in 2024's reading. So it was a nice standout, it was a nice breath of fresh air, a nice reminder that I do indeed like thriller books, and I would recommend picking it up. The remaining books I have to talk about were all 5 stars. I had 3 5-star reads this month. That is like unheard of for me. I am so excited about this. I had such a good month of reading. I read so much, and then to have 3 5-star reads is bananas, and I am so happy it happened. The first one was kind of a shoo-in, and that is Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez. This is the sequel to Part of Your World, and I kind of just knew I was gonna love this, but I didn't really know how much I was going to love this until I actually read it. Like a lot of romance series, this is a spin-off story, so you don't have to have read the first book in the series to read this one. This is following different characters and their little romance story, but they are both so good. They are both 5 stars for me, so I definitely recommend reading Part of Your World and then reading this one. In this story, you're following 2 doctors, Brianna and Jacob. And Jacob is new to the hospital Brianna's been working at, and Brianna's been wanting to get this promotion for a while. When Jacob comes in, it's kind of a threat to her getting that promotion because it's looking like he might be a candidate for it as well. And he makes a really bad first impression on her, so she just writes him off and thinks he's really rude and doesn't like him. But everyone else says how great and wonderful he is. And she's like, what do you mean? That guy was kind of a jerk. And then he writes her a letter. And it's a really, really good letter. And then they start sending letters back and forth to each other, and you watch their romance blossom. There is just so much wonderfulness in this story. Abby Jimenez's romances from the 2 I've read now, I've read Part of Your World, and this one hit on more real world problems, and they're typically heavier. There's elements of grief and sadness and loss in them in different ways. So there are some heavier topics in this one, but it's a lot of real world stuff, real life challenges people have to figure out when they're falling in love with someone and accepting their baggage in different ways. But overall, it was so freaking cute. I was listening to the audiobook of this one while I was driving, and I would be like laughing and giggling and just wanting to like kick my feet because it was so cute, and it just really reminds you of the feeling of falling in love. Abby Jimenez is such a good writer. Her romances are so good. If you haven't read this yet, what are you doing? I waited too long to read it. I should have read it when it first came out. I should have known. It'd be great. Next is Diavola. This is another book I read in that thriller and horror arcs reading vlog, so you can check out that video for full thoughts on this one. This was one that kind of snuck up on me. I didn't know it was going to be a 5-star until I was getting towards the end of it. It's a story about this family going on this Italian vacation, and the place that they're staying at is sort of haunted. One of the main horrors of this story is toxic family dynamics. The main character you're following is sort of the outcast black sheep of her family, and you just see how she's treated by her family, and just, you know, her having to be on this Italian vacation with her family is like exhausting in different ways. And so that's a lot of what's being played up in the story. It is a slow burn. It takes a while to build, but then the story kind of shifts, and I don't want to give away how, but I just really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed this main character. She's like one of my favorite main characters. I found her to be relatable and funny, and I was just like exhausted with her on this experience that she undergoes. I don't know if it's gonna be for everybody because it is slower and it's a little bit quirky in a sense, a little bit weird, a little bit quirky, but maybe not in the way you would expect it to be. It's a little bit hard for me to like put a pin on and completely describe, which I think is why I ended up enjoying it so much, because it did just feel a little bit different, a little bit fresh, and I got to be pleasantly surprised by it because I wasn't sure what to expect, what direction the story was going to go, and then I ended up just having a lot of fun with it. And then the final 5-star read I have is The Mysterious Case of the Alperton Angels by Janice Hallett, which I read in my mystery reading vlog if you want to see my full experience with it. This is a mixed media slash found footage, I guess you could call it, type of mystery that is crafted together in a beautiful, complex, intricate, wonderful, incredibly amazing, wonderful way. The setup of this story is that you have found all of these documents in this box, and you can read through them, and at the end you can decide if you want to give them to the police or just pleasantly put them back away and act like you never saw them. So that right off the bat got me hooked into this story. I was like, oh, that's a fun little framing device. And then you go through and you're reading all of this different mixed media, which includes text messages, emails, interview transcripts, selections from books, a script from a movie that never got produced, and a lot of different materials that is all cohesively telling this story about this woman, Amanda, who is a journalist that is investigating this crime that happened 18 years ago. The crime that this is centered on is the mysterious case of the Alperton Angels, which which is this case where all of these cult members were found murdered. They called themselves angels. They were in Alperton, and a couple people ended up getting away, including a baby. And now 18 years later, that baby is going to be an adult. And so Amanda's trying to trace who that baby is and what happened to them to try to get a new, fresh take on being able to tell this true crime story and to publish a new book about it. This was just so clever and intricate. There were so many pieces that had to fall into place for this to work, and it was just so effective. I was so impressed by it. I had such a good time with it, and by the end, I just wanted to start it over and read it all again. And I just want to read more from Janice Hallett. I want to read more books like this. I've never really read a book like this before that is a bunch of mixed media entirely, and I always felt like maybe that would be harder to get into, harder to follow. And honestly, it kind of was in the beginning of this book. Like the first 60 and 70 pages was me just getting used to the story. But once I found my rhythm with it, I was fully immersed. I felt like I was a person who came across documents and was like trying to trace what was going on in the case. And it was so much fun. So I really recommend this one if you like murder mysteries, darker murder mysteries, mixed media, found footage types of things, themes around cults and coercion and storytelling, vengeance, justice. If any of those things are sticking out to you, or if all of those things are sticking out to you, I would definitely recommend picking this up. So that is it for all the books that I read this month. It was a big month. It was a good month. I still can't believe I found 3 5-star reads. That is just unheard of for me to find 3 5 stars in a month, and I'm hoping I can just keep the energy going for March. I'm feeling really good about my reading year. We're off to a really good start, and I think a lot of that has to do with just following what I want to read, stepping outside of my comfort zone, taking risks. It sounds so silly. It's just reading. Like, of course you can read whatever you want, but I don't know. I'm trying different things. I'm having fun with it, and it's leading to some really great results. So I hope you're having a good reading year too. Let me know down in the comments below if you've read any of the books I talked about today, or if I convinced you to pick any of them up. But that is it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video. Bye.